Imagine dying so filthy that maggots feast on your living flesh while you still draw breath. Picture a queen so terrified of water that she would rather endure the agony of rotting alive than allow a single drop to touch her skin. This is not a tale from the darkest corners of fiction, but the horrifying reality of one of history's most tragic royal figures. Her name was Isabella of Castile, and her story reveals a truth more shocking than any horror movie could ever conjure. But wait, you might be thinking of Isabella the Catholic, the famous queen who funded Columbus. You would be wrong. This is a different Isabella entirely, one whose name has been deliberately buried beneath centuries of royal shame and historical embarrassment. This Isabella ruled during one of the most turbulent periods of European history, and her pathological fear of bathing would ultimately lead to one of the gruesome deaths ever recorded in the annals of royalty. How does a queen surrounded by the finest physicians and luxuries of her time end up dying in such a horrific manner? What drove her to such extreme behavior that even her own courtiers couldn't bear to be in the same room? And why has this story been hidden from history books for so long? Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth behind the queen who never bathed, a story so disturbing that it will forever change how you think about medieval royalty and the dangerous power of obsession. Our story begins in the year 1451 in the Kingdom of Castile, where a baby girl was born into circumstances that would shape her into one of history's most peculiar monarchs. But this was not the Isabella you know from your history books. This was Isabella of Trastamara, a distant cousin of the more famous Isabella the Catholic, born into a minor branch of the royal family that most historians have conveniently forgotten. Isabella of Trastamara came into the world during a time when Europe was emerging from the devastating effects of the Black Death. The plague had claimed nearly half of Europe's population, and the survivors lived in constant fear of disease and contamination. This fear would prove to be the seed that would eventually destroy our Isabella. Her father, Don Carlos of Trastamara, was a minor noble who had managed to secure a small principality through political maneuvering and strategic marriages. Her mother, Constanza de Mendoza, came from a family known for their extreme religious devotion and their peculiar beliefs about physical purity. It was from her mother that Isabella would inherit the obsessions that would ultimately kill her. From her earliest days, Isabella was raised in an environment where physical cleanliness was viewed with deep suspicion. Her mother believed that water, particularly warm water, opened the pores and allowed evil spirits and diseases to enter the body. This wasn't an uncommon belief in the 15th century, but the Mendoza family took it to extremes that bordered on madness.
Imagine dying so filthy that maggots feast on your living flesh while you still draw breath. Picture a queen so terrified of water that she would rather endure the agony of rotting alive than allow a single drop to touch her skin. This is not a tale from the darkest corners of fiction, but the horrifying reality of one of history's most tragic royal figures. Her name was Isabella of Castile, and her story reveals a truth more shocking than any horror movie could ever conjure. But wait, you might be thinking of Isabella the Catholic, the famous queen who funded Columbus. You would be wrong. This is a different Isabella entirely, one whose name has been deliberately buried beneath centuries of royal shame and historical embarrassment. This Isabella ruled during one of the most turbulent periods of European history, and her pathological fear of bathing would ultimately lead to one of the most gruesome deaths ever recorded in the annals of royalty. How does a queen, surrounded by the finest physicians and luxuries of her time, end up dying in such a horrific manner? What drove her to such extreme behavior that even her own courtiers couldn't bear to be in the same room? And why has this story been hidden from history books for so long? Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth behind the queen who never bathed, a story so disturbing that it will forever change how you think about medieval royalty and the dangerous power of obsession. Our story begins in the year 1451 in the Kingdom of Castile, where a baby girl was born into circumstances that would shape her into one of history's most peculiar monarchs. But this was not the Isabella you know from your history books. This was Isabella of Trastamara, a distant cousin of the more famous Isabella the Catholic, born into a minor branch of the royal family that most historians have conveniently forgotten. Isabella of Trastamara came into the world during a time when Europe was emerging from the devastating effects of the Black Death. The plague had claimed nearly half of Europe's population, and the survivors lived in constant fear of disease and contamination. This fear would prove to be the seed that would eventually destroy our Isabella. Her father, Don Carlos of Trastamara, was a minor noble who had managed to secure a small principality through political maneuvering and strategic marriages. Her mother, Constanza de Mendoza, came from a family known for their extreme religious devotion and their peculiar beliefs about physical purity. It was from her mother that Isabella would inherit the obsessions that would ultimately kill her. From her earliest days, Isabella was raised in an environment where physical cleanliness was viewed with deep suspicion. Her mother believed that water, particularly warm water, opened the pores and allowed evil spirits and diseases to enter the body. This wasn't an uncommon belief in the 15th century, but the Mendoza family took it to extremes that bordered on madness.
The marriage negotiations were complicated by Isabella's reputation, which had begun to spread throughout the noble courts of Spain. Potential suitors were warned about the princess who refused to bathe, and many deals fell through when the young men in question got a glimpse of their intended bride. But Fernando was different. He himself had developed peculiar habits during his military campaigns, including a belief that washing weakened a warrior's natural defenses. When Fernando first met Isabella in 1467, witnesses reported that he seemed genuinely charmed by her unconventional appearance. Perhaps it was her intelligence, which remained sharp despite her deteriorating physical condition. Or perhaps it was simply that he recognized a kindred spirit in someone who had also rejected the conventional standards of noble society. Their wedding was held in a small ceremony, attended only by immediate family members. Even then, several guests complained about the overwhelming odor that seemed to follow the bride. Isabella wore a heavy perfume made from crushed flowers and herbs, but it was barely strong enough to mask the smell of her unwashed body. But marriage did nothing to change Isabella's habits. If anything, having a husband who supported her unconventional lifestyle only made her more convinced that she was right to avoid bathing. Fernando, who had been impressed by her strong will, actively encouraged her beliefs, seeing them as a sign of her spiritual purity and strength of character. The young couple was granted a small duchy in the remote mountains of Castile, far from the main royal court. This isolation would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. It allowed Isabella to live according to her own rules, free from the judgment and interference of more conventional nobles. But it also meant that there were fewer people around to notice when her behavior began to cross the line from eccentric to dangerous.
Isabella's path to real power began with a series of deaths that seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. In 1469, just 2 years after her marriage, a plague swept through the royal family of Castile. Isabella's uncle, the king, died first, followed quickly by his son and heir. Within months, 6 members of the royal family had succumbed to the mysterious illness, leaving Isabella as one of the few surviving claimants to the throne. The plague that killed Isabella's relatives was unlike anything physicians had seen before. Victims complained of feeling as though insects were crawling under their skin. They developed horrible sores that seemed to spread from the inside out, and they died in agony, scratching at their flesh until they bled. The similarities to Isabella's childhood trauma, the servant girl found covered in mysterious marks, were not lost on her. To Isabella, the plague was proof that her mother had been right all along. The other members of the royal family had died because they had contaminated themselves with water and allowed evil influences to enter their bodies. She, who had remained pure and uncontaminated, had been spared. This wasn't just survival, it was divine vindication of her lifestyle. But claiming the throne was not simply a matter of being the last one alive. Isabella faced challenges from several other distant relatives, and the nobility was deeply divided about whether a woman with such strange habits could effectively rule the kingdom. Many questioned whether someone who refused to maintain basic hygiene could handle the complex responsibilities of governing a nation. Isabella's supporters, led by her husband Fernando, launched a propaganda campaign that portrayed her unusual habits as signs of her exceptional piety and spiritual purity. They spread stories claiming that Isabella's unwashed state was actually a form of religious devotion, similar to the practices of certain saints who had rejected worldly vanities in favor of spiritual pursuits. The Catholic Church, which held enormous influence in Castile, was initially skeptical of these claims. Several bishops publicly questioned whether a ruler who neglected the body that God had given her could truly be considered devout. But Isabella had powerful allies among the more extreme religious orders, particularly the Franciscans, who saw her lifestyle as embodying their ideals of poverty and rejection of worldly pleasures. The political situation was further complicated by the fact that Isabella's most serious rival for the throne was her own cousin, Don Alfonso de Trastamara, a man known for his fastidious attention to personal grooming and his love of luxury. The contrast between the two candidates could not have been more stark. Alfonso represented the traditional model of kingship, elegant, refined, and concerned with maintaining the proper appearance of royalty. Isabella represented something entirely different, a return to what her supporters claimed were the pure, uncorrupted values of earlier times. The civil war that followed lasted for 3 years and was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Castilian history. But it wasn't just fought with swords and arrows. Both sides engaged in a vicious propaganda war, with Alfonso's supporters spreading increasingly grotesque stories about Isabella's personal habits and appearance. They claimed that she had not changed her clothes in over 2 years, that her hair was so matted it had become home to families of lice and fleas, and that the smell emanating from her body was so strong it could be detected from across a room.
These stories, while probably exaggerated, were based on enough truth to be believable. Witnesses who had met Isabella confirmed that her appearance and odor were indeed shocking, even by the relaxed standards of medieval hygiene.
But Isabella's supporters fought back with stories of their own. They claimed that Isabella's body emanated a sweet, supernatural fragrance that could only be detected by the truly pure of heart. They spread tales of miraculous healings that occurred when people touched Isabella's unwashed robes, and they insisted that her unusual appearance was actually a sign of her special connection to the divine. The turning point in the war came in 1472, during the Battle of Toro. Isabella, despite her physical condition, insisted on leading her troops personally into battle. The sight of their strange, unwashed queen riding at the head of her army had a profound psychological effect on both her own soldiers and her enemies. Isabella's troops, many of whom had come to believe the stories about her divine protection, fought with fanatical devotion. They believed that their queen's unusual purity made her invulnerable to enemy weapons, and this belief gave them courage that bordered on recklessness. Alfonso's soldiers, on the other hand, were reportedly so disturbed by Isabella's appearance that many fled rather than face her in combat. The battle was a decisive victory for Isabella, and Alfonso was killed when his horse threw him while he was trying to escape the field. With her main rival dead, Isabella's path to the throne was clear. But winning the crown would prove to be far easier than keeping it. Isabella's coronation took place in the Cathedral of Toledo in the spring of 1473. The ceremony had to be modified significantly to accommodate her unusual habits. Traditional coronation rituals required the monarch to be anointed with holy oils, but Isabella refused to allow the oils to be applied to her skin, claiming that any foreign substance might contaminate her natural purity. Instead, the oils were applied to her clothes, which she had not changed in months. The Archbishop of Toledo, who performed the ceremony, later wrote in his private diary that the experience was one of the most challenging of his career. The smell emanating from the new queen was so overwhelming that several participants in the ceremony became physically ill. But Isabella seemed oblivious to the discomfort she was causing others. In her mind, she had achieved the ultimate vindication of her beliefs. She had survived when others had died. She had won battles when others had lost, and now she wore the crown of Castile. All of this, she was convinced, was because she had remained pure and uncontaminated, while others had weakened themselves through the corrupting influence of water and cleanliness. These policies were met with resistance from physicians and from the more educated members of the nobility, but Isabella's supporters in the church backed her completely. They proclaimed that the new queen's policies were based on divine revelation, and that anyone who opposed them was risking their eternal soul. The early years of Isabella's reign were marked by a series of natural disasters and military victories that seemed to confirm her supporters' claims about her divine protection. A severe drought that had plagued the kingdom for several years ended shortly after her coronation. Enemy armies that had been threatening the borders suddenly withdrew or were defeated by much smaller Castilian forces. But these successes came at a cost that was becoming increasingly apparent to those who had to work closely with the queen. Isabella's personal hygiene continued to deteriorate, and her behavior became more erratic and obsessive.
She began to see threats everywhere and became convinced that anyone who suggested she needed to clean herself was actually an agent of the evil forces that had killed her family members. The descent into madness. By the 5th year of her reign, Isabella's obsession with avoiding water had evolved into something far more dangerous than simple eccentricity. What had begun as an unusual religious belief had transformed into a full-blown psychological disorder that affected every aspect of her life and rule. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Isabella began to refuse to touch anything that had been washed or cleaned. Her servants reported that she would fly into violent rages if she discovered that her clothes, bedding, or eating utensils had been cleaned without her knowledge. She became convinced that the act of washing anything in her presence was actually an attempt to contaminate her through proximity. Isabella's dining habits became particularly disturbing. She would only eat food that had been prepared without water, which severely limited her diet and began to affect her physical health. She subsisted mainly on dried meats, stale bread, and wine, refusing even fruits and vegetables that had been rinsed before preparation. Her appearance, which had been shocking even during her rise to power, became truly horrifying. Courtiers who had known her for years began to struggle to recognize the woman who had once been considered intelligent and charismatic. Her hair, which hadn't been washed in over a decade, had become a solid mass of grease and filth that hung around her shoulders like a dirty curtain. But it was her skin that showed the most dramatic changes. What had once been a grayish pallor had developed into something far worse. Isabella's skin had taken on a mottled appearance, with patches of different colors and textures covering her body. Some areas appeared to be scaling or flaking off, while others had developed a waxy, almost translucent quality.
The smell that emanated from Isabella had also evolved beyond simple body odor into something that defied description. Visitors to the court reported that they could detect her presence from several rooms away, and many complained of nausea and headaches after spending time in her company. Several ambassadors from foreign courts requested to conduct their business outdoors or through intermediaries rather than meet with the Queen directly. Isabella's mental state was deteriorating along with her physical condition. She began to exhibit signs of paranoid delusions, becoming convinced that there were vast conspiracies working against her. But these weren't typical political conspiracies. Isabella believed that she was being targeted by supernatural forces that were trying to force her to contaminate herself with water. She became obsessed with the idea that everyone around her was secretly working to expose her to water. She began to suspect her own servants of trying to sneak drops of water into her food or onto her clothing. Several loyal servants were banished from court or even executed based on Isabella's paranoid accusations. The Queen's husband, Fernando, had initially supported her unusual habits, but even he began to be disturbed by the direction things were heading. He tried to gently suggest that perhaps Isabella could compromise by allowing herself to be cleaned with oils or dry cloths, but these suggestions sent her into such violent fits of rage that he quickly learned to avoid the topic entirely. Fernando began spending more and more time away from court, leading military campaigns or conducting diplomatic missions that kept him away from his wife for months at a time. When he was present, he maintained separate living quarters and avoided physical contact with Isabella whenever possible. The isolation that Fernando's absences created only made Isabella's condition worse. Without anyone close to her who was willing to challenge her delusions, she retreated further into her obsessive beliefs.
she began to interpret every minor event as confirmation of her theories about the dangers of cleanliness. If a servant fell ill after cleaning something, Isabella saw it as proof that water was dangerous. If she successfully avoided some minor political crisis, she attributed it to her pure, uncontaminated state. Her ability to see reality clearly became increasingly compromised as her mind worked to fit every experience into her delusional framework. The physical effects of Isabella's lifestyle were becoming impossible to ignore. Court physicians, working from a distance due to the Queen's refusal to be examined, began to document changes in her condition that went far beyond simple dirtiness. She had developed persistent sores on her skin that refused to heal, and some areas of her body appeared to be undergoing a kind of slow decay even while she was still alive.
Isabella's refusal to allow medical examination made it impossible for physicians to provide proper treatment, but their observations from a distance suggested that she was suffering from a combination of severe malnutrition, multiple infections, and possibly some form of autoimmune disorder triggered by her extreme lifestyle. The smell emanating from Isabella had become so overpowering that modifications had to be made to the royal palace. Special ventilation systems were installed to try to manage the odor, and meetings with the Queen were moved to the largest possible rooms to minimize the concentration of the smell. Despite these measures, many people still found it physically impossible to remain in Isabella's presence for extended periods. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Isabella's deteriorating condition was that she seemed completely unaware of it. In her mind, she was achieving greater and greater levels of purity and spiritual perfection. She interpreted the horror and disgust of those around her as evidence of their spiritual corruption and inability to recognize true holiness. Isabella began to claim that she was receiving visions and divine messages that confirmed her beliefs. She described elaborate conversations with saints and angels who praised her for maintaining her purity in the face of worldly temptation. These visions became more frequent and more detailed as her physical condition worsened, suggesting that her deteriorating brain was creating elaborate hallucinations to support her delusions. The Queen's behavior during court ceremonies became increasingly erratic and disturbing. She would interrupt important proceedings to deliver long, rambling speeches about the dangers of contamination and the importance of maintaining bodily purity. Foreign diplomats reported back to their home countries that the Queen of Castile appeared to be suffering from some form of madness. But Isabella still held absolute power, and her supporters in the religious hierarchy continued to defend her behavior as divinely inspired. They claimed that the Queen's unusual condition was actually a form of living sainthood, and they began to encourage pilgrims to come to court to witness her holy presence. This created a bizarre situation where Isabella's court became a destination for religious pilgrims who came seeking spiritual enlightenment from the unwashed Queen. Many of these pilgrims were themselves suffering from mental illness or religious mania, and their presence only reinforced Isabella's delusions about her special spiritual status.
The combination of Isabella's deteriorating mental state and the echo chamber of supporters who reinforced her beliefs created a perfect storm that would ultimately lead to her destruction. She had surrounded herself with people who told her that her increasingly disturbing condition was actually evidence of her spiritual superiority, making it impossible for her to recognize the danger she was in. As Isabella entered the final phase of her life, she was no longer capable of distinguishing between reality
and the elaborate fantasy world that her diseased mind had created. She truly believed that she was achieving something magnificent through her refusal to bathe, even as her body began to literally rot around her. While Isabella descended deeper into her madness, the Kingdom of Castile was facing a crisis that threatened to tear it apart. The Queen's bizarre behavior and increasingly erratic rule had created a power vacuum that ambitious nobles and foreign enemies were eager to exploit. The first major challenge came from Isabella's own nobles, many of whom had initially supported her rise to power but were now having serious doubts about her fitness to rule. The Duke of Alba, one of Isabella's earliest allies, privately began organizing what amounted to an intervention. He gathered a group of trusted advisors and physicians who he hoped could convince the Queen to seek treatment for her obvious illness. But Isabella's paranoid delusions had made her suspicious of everyone, including her oldest supporters. When the Duke of Alba requested a private audience to discuss her health, Isabella immediately assumed that he was part of a conspiracy to force her into contamination. She ordered him arrested on charges of treason and had him executed without trial. The execution of the Duke of Alba sent shockwaves through the Castilian nobility. Here was a man who had fought beside Isabella during her rise to power, who had defended her against all critics, and who had asked for nothing more than a chance to express his concerns about her welfare. His brutal execution made it clear that Isabella was no longer the rational, if eccentric, ruler they had once known. Other nobles began to distance themselves from the royal court, citing various excuses to avoid spending time in Isabella's presence. Some claimed to be needed on their estates to manage agricultural concerns. Others suddenly discovered urgent diplomatic missions that required their attention in distant lands. The result was that Isabella became increasingly isolated, surrounded only by the most fanatical of her religious supporters and by servants who were too terrified to express any dissent. The kingdom's military situation was also deteriorating rapidly. Isabella's husband, Fernando, who had been the kingdom's primary military leader, was spending less and less time at court due to his wife's condition. When he was present, he was often too disturbed by Isabella's appearance and behavior to focus effectively on military planning.
Neighboring kingdoms had noticed Castile's weakness and were beginning to test its borders with increasing frequency. Raiding parties from Aragon crossed into Castilian territory almost weekly, and the kingdom's response was slow and disorganized. The army, which had once been fiercely loyal to Isabella, was beginning to question whether they were serving a queen or a madwoman. The economic situation was equally dire. Isabella's policies regarding cleanliness had created chaos in many industries that depended on water for their operations. Textile manufacturers, who needed to wash wool and cloth as part of their production process, found themselves subject to heavy fines and restrictions. Brewers and vintners, whose trades required extensive use of water, faced similar challenges. Many skilled craftsmen and merchants began leaving Castile to neighboring kingdoms where they could practice their trades without fear of violating the Queen's increasingly arbitrary rules about contamination. This brain drain weakened the kingdom's economy and reduced the tax revenues that Isabella needed to maintain her military and government. But perhaps the most serious crisis facing Castile was the growing religious conflict that Isabella's policies had created. While some extreme religious orders supported the Queen's interpretation of physical purity, the mainstream Catholic Church was beginning to have serious doubts about her claims to divine inspiration. The Pope,
had received numerous reports about Isabella's condition from bishops and other church officials who had visited the Castilian court. These reports painted a picture of a ruler who was clearly suffering from some form of mental illness, but who was being enabled by religious fanatics who saw political advantage in supporting her delusions. A papal investigation was quietly launched to determine whether Isabella's claims about divine visions were genuine or whether she was suffering from demonic possession or simple madness. The investigators, working under strict secrecy, gathered testimony from dozens of witnesses who had observed the Queen's behavior firsthand. The resulting report, which was kept secret for centuries, concluded that Isabella was almost certainly suffering from a severe mental illness that had been exacerbated by malnutrition and possible poisoning from the toxins that had accumulated in her unwashed body. The investigators found no evidence of genuine divine inspiration and recommended that the Church withdraw its support for Isabella's regime. But before the Pope could act on these recommendations, events in Castile took a dramatic turn that would make papal intervention irrelevant. Isabella's physical condition, which had been deteriorating steadily for years, was about to reach a crisis point that would shock the medieval world.
The first sign that something catastrophic was about to happen came when Isabella's servants began reporting strange sounds coming from the Queen's private chambers. They described scratching and scurrying noises that seemed to come from inside the walls, accompanied by a smell that was somehow even worse than the already overwhelming odor that surrounded Isabella. When brave servants investigated, they discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Isabella's refusal to change her clothing or allow her bedding to be cleaned had created an environment that was literally crawling with life. Insects of every description had made their homes in the filth that surrounded the Queen, and they were no longer content to simply live in her clothing and bedding. The most horrifying discovery was that Isabella's own body had become host to various parasites and insects that were beginning to feed on her living flesh. Her refusal to allow medical examination had prevented anyone from noticing the early stages of this infestation, and by the time it became obvious, it was far too late to do anything about it. Isabella herself seemed unaware of what was happening to her body. Her mental state had deteriorated to the point where she was barely capable of distinguishing between reality and hallucination. She continued to hold court and attempt to govern the kingdom, even as her body literally rotted around her. The servants who were forced to attend to Isabella during this period later testified that the experience was like something from their worst nightmares. They described a queen who was technically still alive, but whose body was being consumed by creatures that had made their home in her unwashed flesh. But even as Isabella's physical form was being destroyed, her grip on power remained absolute. The fanatical religious supporters who surrounded her interpreted her horrific condition as the ultimate proof of her sanctity. They claimed that she was undergoing a holy transformation that would eventually elevate her to sainthood. Foreign ambassadors who arrived at court during this period were so shocked by what they witnessed that many of them fled the kingdom immediately. Those who remained long enough to conduct business reported back to their home countries that the Queen of Castile was clearly dying, but that no one in her government seemed willing or able to acknowledge this reality. The final phase of Isabella's life would prove to be the most disturbing chapter in a story that was already unprecedented in its horror.
As her body continued to decay and her mind retreated further into delusion, the kingdom she ruled began to prepare for the inevitable end of her reign. But Isabella herself remained convinced that she was on the verge of achieving the ultimate spiritual triumph. In her diseased mind, the creatures that were devouring her living flesh were actually angels come to carry her to heaven. She faced her approaching death not with fear or regret, but with the fanatical joy of someone who believed she was about to be rewarded for her lifetime of sacrifice.
The last months of Isabella's life were a descent into horror so profound that even the most detailed historical accounts struggle to capture its full scope. What was happening to the queen went beyond simple neglect of hygiene and entered territory that challenged the very boundaries of what the human body could endure while still maintaining life. By the winter of 1481, Isabella had not bathed, changed her clothes, or allowed her bedding to be cleaned in over 15 years. The accumulated filth on her body had created an ecosystem of decay that supported a thriving population of insects, parasites, and other creatures that had made their home in and on her living flesh. The servants who were brave enough to enter Isabella's chambers reported scenes that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The queen's hair had become so matted and infested that it moved with a life of its own as various creatures crawled through it. Her clothing, which hadn't been removed in years, had essentially fused with her skin in many places, creating a second skin of rotting fabric and accumulated waste. But the most horrifying aspect of Isabella's condition was what was happening to her actual body underneath this layer of filth. Areas of her skin had begun to break down and rot while she was still alive, creating open wounds that attracted flies and other insects. These creatures laid their eggs in Isabella's living flesh, and when the eggs hatched, the resulting larvae began to feed on her body from the inside out. Isabella was literally being eaten alive by maggots, but her mental state had deteriorated to the point where she seemed unaware of what was happening to her. She continued to hold court, receive visitors, and attempt to govern her kingdom, even as her body was being consumed by the creatures that had made their home in her rotting flesh. The smell that emanated from Isabella during this period was so overwhelming that it became impossible for anyone to remain in her presence for more than a few minutes at a time. Even her most fanatical supporters, who had previously claimed that her odor was actually a sweet, divine fragrance, were forced to admit that something had changed. Many began wearing cloth soaked in strong perfumes over their faces when they had to be near the queen. Court physicians, working from the greatest possible distance, attempted to document what they were observing. Their notes, which survived in the archives of the royal court, describe a medical situation that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. They estimated that Isabella's body was host to thousands of individual parasites and insects, ranging from common lice and fleas to exotic species that apparently had been attracted by the unique environment she had created.
The physician's reports also noted that Isabella seemed to be surviving in a state that should have been impossible for a human being. The toxins produced by the decay and the waste products of the creatures living on her body should have killed her within days, yet she continued to function, albeit in an increasingly limited capacity. Some modern medical experts who have studied these historical accounts believe that Isabella may have developed a form of immunity to the toxins that were slowly poisoning her, allowing her to survive longer than should have been possible.
Others suggest that her body had essentially become a living corpse, maintained by the same processes that allowed the creatures feeding on her to survive. But Isabella herself remained convinced that what was happening to her was evidence of her approaching spiritual transformation. She described elaborate visions in which the creatures consuming her body were actually angels come to prepare her for her ascension to heaven. She spoke of feeling lighter each day as the earthly impurities were consumed, leaving behind only her pure spiritual essence. These delusions were supported by the religious fanatics who still surrounded her. They proclaimed that Isabella was undergoing the ultimate test of faith, and that her willingness to endure such suffering proved her worthiness for sainthood. They began to collect samples of the filth from her body and clothing, claiming that these relics would have miraculous healing powers. The situation in the royal court had become so surreal that visiting diplomats began to question whether they were witnessing reality or some elaborate theatrical performance. The contrast between the formal protocols of royal government and the horrifying reality of the Queen's condition created a cognitive dissonance that many found impossible to process. Isabella's husband, Fernando, had by this point completely withdrawn from court life. He maintained residences in distant parts of the kingdom and communicated with his wife only through intermediaries. When pressed by foreign allies to explain his wife's condition, he would only say that the Queen was undergoing a period of intense spiritual devotion that required privacy and understanding. The kingdom's government continued to function, but only because a small group of administrators had essentially taken over the day-to-day operations while maintaining the fiction that Isabella was still in charge. These men, led by the court secretary Don Luis de Mendoza, performed a delicate balancing act of implementing necessary policies while avoiding any actions that might provoke Isabella's paranoid suspicions. Isabella's ordeal approached its end as winter turned to spring in 1482. The creatures that had been feeding on her body were running out of living tissue to consume, and her vital organs were beginning to shut down under the accumulated stress of years of toxicity and malnutrition.
But even as her body prepared for death, Isabella's mind remained trapped in its delusional framework. She continued to speak of her approaching transformation and expressed excitement about the spiritual rewards that awaited her. She seemed genuinely happy about what was happening to her, viewing her approaching death not as a tragedy, but as the culmination of a lifetime of spiritual achievement. The Queen's final days were spent in a state that witnesses described as alternating between periods of apparent peace and episodes of intense physical agony. During her lucid moments, she would speak calmly about her visions and express gratitude for the opportunity to prove her faith through suffering. But these peaceful interludes were interrupted by periods where the pain of her condition would break through her delusions, causing her to scream and thrash about in ways that terrified even her most devoted servants. On May 15, 1482, Isabella of Castile finally succumbed to the consequences of her extreme lifestyle. But even in her death, her story would continue to shock and horrify those who witnessed its final chapter. When Isabella finally died, the discovery of her body created one of the most shocking scenes in the recorded history of European royalty. The servants who entered her chamber on the morning of May 16, 1482,
found something that challenged their ability to comprehend what they were seeing. Isabella's body, or what remained of it, was so thoroughly infested with living creatures that it was difficult to determine where her flesh ended and the ecosystem that had consumed her began. Thousands of maggots, flies, beetles, and other insects swarmed over and through what had once been a human form. The smell was so overwhelming that several servants collapsed immediately upon entering the room. The court physician, Dr. Alfonso de Herrera, was summoned to examine the body and provide an official cause of death. His report, which was sealed and hidden in the royal archives for centuries, described a scene that defied medical understanding. According to Dr. Herrera, Isabella's body had been so thoroughly consumed by parasites and decay that it was impossible to identify many of her internal organs. The physician estimated that the Queen's body contained over 10,000 individual creatures of various species. Some were common parasites that had simply grown to unusually large sizes due to the abundance of food and the lack of any attempts to control them. Others were exotic species that Dr. Herrera could not identify, suggesting that Isabella's unique condition had attracted insects and other creatures from far beyond the normal range of the castle. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Herrera's report was his conclusion that many of these creatures had been feeding on Isabella while she was still alive. The patterns of decay and consumption suggested that the process had been ongoing for months or possibly even years before her death. Isabella had literally been eaten alive, slowly and systematically by the very ecosystem she had created through her refusal to maintain basic hygiene.
The task of preparing Isabella's body for burial presented unprecedented challenges. Traditional embalming procedures were impossible due to the extent of the infestation and decay. The royal embalmers, who had prepared the bodies of kings and queens for generations, declared that they had never encountered anything like Isabella's condition and weren't sure how to proceed. The first attempt to clean the body resulted in a catastrophic discovery. When the embalmers tried to remove Isabella's clothing, which had been fused to her skin for years, they found that large sections of her body simply fell apart. The fabric had become so integrated with her rotting flesh that separating them caused what remained of her body to disintegrate. Church officials were called in to determine whether Isabella's remains could even be given a Christian burial. The Bishop of Toledo, who had crowned Isabella nearly a decade earlier, examined the remains and declared that what they were looking at was no longer recognizably human. He struggled with the theological question of whether these remains could truly be said to contain a soul that had departed for the afterlife. The decision was eventually made to bury Isabella's remains in a sealed lead coffin without attempting any further preparation or embalming. The coffin was filled with lime and other chemicals designed to accelerate decomposition and eliminate the remaining insects and parasites. Even so, the smell emanating from the sealed coffin was so strong that the burial had to be conducted outdoors, with mourners standing at a considerable distance. Isabella's funeral was unlike any royal burial in European history. The usual elaborate ceremonies and public mourning were replaced by a hurried private affair, attended only by a handful of the most devoted clergy and a few court officials who felt obligated to pay their respects. Most of the nobility, including Isabella's own husband, found excuses to be elsewhere during the burial. The religious officials who conducted the funeral service struggled with how to memorialize a queen whose death had been so horrific.
Traditional funeral orations celebrating the deceased's life and virtues seemed inappropriate given the circumstances of Isabella's death. Instead, the service focused on prayers for the forgiveness of sins and the hope that Isabella's soul had found peace despite the horrors that had consumed her physical form. But even in death, Isabella's story was not finished. The servants who had witnessed her final condition began to spread accounts of what they had seen, and these stories quickly took on their own life. Some claimed that Isabella's death had been a divine punishment for her pride and refusal to maintain the body that God had given her. Others insisted that her willingness to endure such suffering proved her exceptional holiness.
The religious fanatics who had supported Isabella during her lifetime continued to proclaim her sanctity even after her death. They claimed that her horrific end was actually a form of martyrdom and began to petition the church to recognize her as a saint. They collected soil from the area around her grave, claiming it had miraculous healing properties due to its proximity to Isabella's sacred remains. These claims of sanctity were met with horror and revulsion by mainstream church authorities. The Bishop of Toledo issued a formal statement declaring that Isabella's death was a tragedy, not a miracle, and that anyone claiming her remains had healing powers was guilty of blasphemy. The church launched an investigation into the cult that was forming around Isabella's memory and took steps to suppress the spread of stories about her supposed martyrdom. Fernando, Isabella's widowed husband, retreated completely from public life after his wife's death. He retired to a monastery where he spent his remaining years in prayer and penance. Those who knew him reported that he seemed haunted by guilt over his failure to intervene in Isabella's descent into madness. He never spoke publicly about Isabella's condition or death, and he refused all requests to remarry or to take any role in governing the kingdom they had once ruled together. The immediate aftermath of Isabella's death created a succession crisis that threatened to plunge Castile back into civil war. Isabella and Fernando had produced no surviving children, partly due to Isabella's condition making marital relations impossible in her later years. Several distant relatives came forward, claiming the right to inherit the throne, and each had their own version of how Isabella should be remembered. Some claimants tried to distance themselves from Isabella's legacy, portraying her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism. Others attempted to capitalize on the cult that had formed around her memory, claiming that their connection to the Saint Queen gave them a divine right to rule. The competing narratives about Isabella's life and death became weapons in the political battle for control of Castile. The crisis was eventually resolved when Alfonso de Trastamara, a distant cousin who had been living in exile, returned to claim the throne. Alfonso had spent Isabella's reign in Portugal and had not been contaminated by association with her regime. He presented himself as a return to traditional, rational monarchy and promised to restore Castile to its former glory. One of Alfonso's first acts as king was the order of the demolition of the wing of the royal palace where Isabella had spent her final years. The rooms where she had lived and died were considered so contaminated that they were deemed unfit for human habitation. The stones from these rooms were buried in an unmarked location, and the area was blessed by multiple priests in an attempt to cleanse it of whatever evil influences might remain.
But despite these efforts to erase Isabella's legacy, her story continued to circulate in whispered conversations and secret writings. The horror of her death was so unprecedented that it became a subject of fascination for scholars, physicians, and theologians who tried to understand how such a thing could have happened to a person in a position of ultimate power and privilege. The full extent of Isabella's horrific death was deliberately concealed by those who came to power after her. King Alfonso and his advisors understood that the truth about Isabella's condition would damage not just her memory, but the reputation of the monarchy itself. How could the people trust royal authority if they knew that a queen had been allowed to literally rot alive while her courtiers did nothing to help her? The official version of Isabella's death, released to the public and to foreign courts, claimed that she had died of a brief illness brought on by her extreme religious devotions. This version portrayed her death as tragic but noble, suggesting that she had sacrificed her health in service of her spiritual beliefs. No mention was made of the true condition of her body and the horrific circumstances of her final months. But concealing the truth required the cooperation of dozens of people who had witnessed Isabella's condition firsthand. Servants, physicians, clergy, and court officials all had to be convinced to remain silent about what they had seen. Some were willing to cooperate out of loyalty to the monarchy or fear of punishment. Others had to be persuaded through more direct means. King Alfonso established a secret fund that was used to provide generous pensions to anyone who had witnessed Isabella's condition and agreed to remain silent about it. Servants who had attended the queen during her final years were given land grants and titles that ensured their comfortable retirement. Physicians and clergy received appointments to prestigious positions in exchange for their silence. But not everyone could be bought or intimidated into silence. A few individuals, driven by conscience or horror at what they had witnessed, attempted to tell the truth about Isabella's death. These people faced swift and severe consequences that served as a warning to others who might be tempted to speak out.
The monk was subjected to a trial that was conducted in complete secrecy. The evidence presented against him included his own writings describing Isabella's condition, which the court declared to be the product of demonic influence and mental illness. Brother Francisco was found guilty of blasphemy and heresy and was sentenced to be burned at the stake. His execution was carried out in private, and his ashes were scattered to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for those who might sympathize with his cause. Similar fates awaited other individuals who attempted to preserve or spread the truth about Isabella's death. A court physician named Dr. Miguel de Salamanca was found dead in his chambers after writing a detailed medical report about the Queen's condition. His death was officially attributed to a heart attack brought on by stress, but those who found his body reported that his papers had been ransacked and his medical notes had been stolen. The campaign to suppress the truth about Isabella's death was so thorough that within a generation, most people in Castile had no idea what had really happened to their former queen. The official version of her death became accepted history, and the horrific reality was preserved only in a few secret documents hidden in royal archives and church vaults. But the psychological impact of Isabella's death on those who had witnessed it could not be erased so easily. Many of the servants who had attended her during her final years suffered from what we would now recognize as severe trauma. They experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and physical symptoms that made it difficult for them to function normally. Several of these traumatized individuals ended up in monasteries or convents, seeking refuge from memories they couldn't escape.
Others developed obsessive behaviors related to cleanliness and hygiene, as if trying to purge themselves of the contamination they felt from their exposure to Isabella's condition. A few suffered complete mental breakdowns and spent their remaining years in institutions for the insane. The trauma wasn't limited to those who had directly witnessed Isabella's condition. Her husband, Fernando, despite his physical absence during her final months, was haunted by guilt over his failure to intervene. Historical records from the monastery where he spent his final years indicate that he suffered from severe depression and engaged in extreme forms of self-punishment that he believed were necessary to atone for his sins. The religious officials who had supported Isabella's delusions also struggled with the aftermath of her death. Many of them began to question their own judgment and their ability to distinguish between genuine divine inspiration and mental illness. Some left the church entirely, while others became obsessed with rooting out what they saw as false prophets and delusional religious movements. The cover-up of Isabella's death also had broader implications for the Kingdom of Castile and its relationship with neighboring powers. Foreign courts had received reports about the Queen's strange condition, and her sudden death, followed by official silence, created suspicions about what had really happened. Some foreign rulers suspected that Isabella had been murdered by her own courtiers, while others wondered if she had been the victim of some exotic poison or disease.
These suspicions led to a period of diplomatic tension as neighboring kingdoms tried to determine whether Castile was hiding some secret weakness or vulnerability. Trade relationships were affected as merchants and diplomats became reluctant to visit a kingdom that seemed to be concealing important information about its own royal family. The economic impact of the cover-up was also significant. The resources devoted to silencing witnesses and suppressing information could have been used for more productive purposes. The climate of fear and secrecy that surrounded Isabella's death made it difficult for the new government to establish trust with its own people, hampering efforts to rebuild the kingdom's institutions. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the cover-up was the precedent it established for dealing with uncomfortable truths about royal behavior. Future monarchs and their advisors learned that even the most horrific scandals could be successfully concealed if enough resources were devoted to the effort. This lesson would be applied repeatedly throughout European history as rulers sought to hide evidence of their own failures and excesses. The techniques developed to conceal Isabella's death, the use of financial incentives to buy silence, the punishment of those who refused to cooperate, the creation of alternative narratives to replace uncomfortable truths, became a template for royal cover-ups that would be used for centuries to come. Modern medical experts who have studied the historical records of Isabella's case have struggled to understand how her condition could have developed and progressed as it did. The combination of extreme neglect of hygiene, malnutrition, parasitic infestation, and what appears to have been some form of mental illness creates a medical puzzle that challenges our understanding of human physiology and psychology. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a contemporary expert in medieval medicine at the University of Madrid, has spent years studying the surviving documents related to Isabella's case. According to Dr. Rodriguez, Isabella's condition represents a unique intersection of multiple medical and psychological factors that created a perfect storm of physical and mental deterioration. But Isabella's case was complicated by the fact that her psychological problems were supported and encouraged by the people around her. Instead of receiving treatment or intervention, her delusions were reinforced by religious authorities who interpreted her behavior as evidence of spiritual devotion. This created a feedback loop that made it virtually impossible for Isabella to recognize the reality of her situation. The physical consequences of Isabella's refusal to maintain basic hygiene were probably inevitable, given the duration and extremity of her behavior. The human body is not designed to function without regular cleaning, and the accumulation of waste products, dead skin cells, and foreign matter creates an environment that is ideal for the growth of harmful bacteria and parasites. Dr. Rodriguez believes that Isabella's body probably went through several distinct phases of deterioration. The initial phase would have involved the normal consequences of poor hygiene: skin irritation, unpleasant odors, and minor infections. If Isabella had sought treatment at this stage, the problems could have been easily resolved with basic medical care. The second phase would have involved the establishment of a more complex ecosystem of bacteria and parasites that began to feed on the waste products and dead tissue that accumulated on Isabella's body. This phase would have been accompanied by more serious health problems, including malnutrition due to the body's resources being diverted to fight infections. The final phase, which appears to have lasted for months or even years, involved the complete breakdown of the body's natural defenses against parasitic infestation. At this point, Isabella's body became host to a thriving ecosystem of creatures that were literally consuming her living tissue. The fact that she survived as long as she did in this condition suggests that her body may have developed some form of adaptation to the extreme circumstances. But the medical aspects of Isabella's case are only part of the puzzle. Equally important are the psychological mechanisms that allowed her to endure such extreme physical suffering without seeking help or even apparently recognizing the severity of her condition. Dr. Maria Santos, a psychiatrist specializing in religious delusions, has studied Isabella's case as an example of how extreme religious beliefs can override normal survival instincts. According to Dr. Santos, Isabella's mind appears to have constructed an elaborate delusional framework that reinterpreted her physical suffering as evidence of spiritual progress. This type of delusion is not unknown in psychiatric literature, but Isabella's case is unusual in its duration and extremity. Most patients with similar delusions either seek help when their physical condition becomes unbearable, or they die relatively quickly from the medical consequences of their behavior. Isabella's ability to maintain her delusions while enduring months or even years of extreme physical deterioration suggests an unusually strong psychological defense mechanism. Dr. Santos believes that Isabella's delusions were probably reinforced by the hallucinations that would have been caused by the toxins produced by her body's decay and by the malnutrition that resulted from her restricted diet. As her physical condition worsened, her brain would have been increasingly compromised, making it even more difficult for her to recognize reality. The role of Isabella's supporters in maintaining her delusions cannot be overlooked. The religious authorities and court officials who encouraged her beliefs bear significant responsibility for her eventual death. They created an environment where Isabella's increasingly dangerous behavior was interpreted as evidence of her spiritual superiority rather than her mental illness. From a modern medical perspective, Isabella's case represents a perfect example of how untreated mental illness can lead to devastating physical consequences. If she had lived in an era with better understanding of psychological disorders and more effective medical treatments, her condition could almost certainly have been successfully addressed in its early stages.
But Isabella's case also raises troubling questions about the role of authority figures in enabling destructive behavior. The religious officials who supported her delusions and the court officials who failed to intervene were in positions of responsibility and should have recognized that she needed help rather than encouragement. The medical mystery of Isabella's case has implications that extend far beyond historical curiosity. Her story provides insights into the relationship between mental and physical health, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the importance of early intervention in cases of psychological disorder. Modern physicians studying Isabella's case have noted similarities to contemporary cases of severe self-neglect, often associated with conditions like depression, schizophrenia, or dementia. While the specific circumstances of Isabella's case were unique, the underlying patterns of behavior and the medical consequences she experienced can still be observed in patients today. The lesson of Isabella's case is clear. Mental illness, especially when combined with delusional beliefs and enabled by those in positions of authority, can lead to consequences that are far more severe than most people realize. Her story serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining perspective, seeking help when needed, and being willing to challenge authority when it becomes destructive.
The story of Isabella of Trastamara, the queen who died covered in maggots, has left a legacy that extends far beyond the borders of medieval Castile. Though deliberately suppressed by those who came after her, the truth about her horrific death has continued to influence how we think about power, madness, and the dangers of unchecked authority. The most immediate legacy of Isabella's case was the profound impact it had on medical and religious thinking in medieval Europe. Secret reports about her condition circulated among physicians and scholars, creating a new awareness of how extreme religious beliefs could lead to devastating physical consequences. These reports contributed to a gradual shift in medical thinking that began to recognize mental illness as a legitimate medical condition rather than simply a moral failing or spiritual crisis. The Church, which had initially supported Isabella's claims of divine inspiration, was forced to develop more rigorous standards for evaluating claims of religious visions and miraculous experiences. The horror of Isabella's death made it clear that not all extreme religious behavior should be interpreted as evidence of sanctity, and church authorities began to require more careful medical and psychological evaluation of individuals claiming direct communication with the divine. But the most lasting impact of Isabella's story may be its influence on political thought and the concept of royal authority. The fact that a queen could literally rot alive while her courtiers stood by and did nothing raised fundamental questions about the nature of power and the responsibilities of those who serve it. Isabella's case became a cautionary tale that was whispered among European nobility for generations. It served as a reminder that absolute power could be just as destructive to those who wielded it as to those who were subject to it. The image of a queen being consumed by maggots while believing herself to be achieving spiritual perfection became a powerful metaphor for the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining perspective in positions of power. The story also had a profound impact on how European societies thought about the relationship between the individual and the state. Isabella's courtiers had faced an impossible choice between their loyalty to their queen and their recognition that she needed help. Their failure to intervene, while understandable given the political realities of the time,
raised questions about when loyalty becomes complicity and when respect for authority becomes enabling of destructive behavior. These questions would become increasingly relevant as European monarchies evolved toward more absolute forms of power. The lesson of Isabella's case, that even the most powerful individuals could be destroyed by their own delusions if no one was willing to challenge them, became an important argument for maintaining some form of checks and balances, even in monarchical systems. The psychological aspects of Isabella's case also had lasting influence on how European societies understood and dealt with mental illness. Her story provided a vivid example of how untreated psychological problems could escalate into life-threatening conditions, and it helped to establish the principle that mental illness was a medical condition that required intervention, rather than a spiritual trial that should be endured.
The techniques used to cover up Isabella's death also left their mark on European political culture. The successful suppression of the truth about her condition demonstrated that even the most shocking scandals could be concealed if enough resources were devoted to the effort. This lesson would be applied repeatedly by future rulers who sought to hide their own failures and excesses from public scrutiny. But perhaps the most significant long-term legacy of Isabella's case is the way it has influenced our understanding of the relationship between power and responsibility. Her story serves as a reminder that those in positions of authority have obligations not just to their subjects, but to themselves and to the institutions they represent. Isabella's failure to maintain even basic self-care while claiming divine authority to rule others reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of many authoritarian systems. How can someone who cannot manage their own life be trusted to manage the lives of others? How can someone who is detached from reality make decisions that affect the real world? These questions remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with issues of political authority and accountability. Isabella's story reminds us that power without wisdom is dangerous, and that authority without humility can be destructive not just to those who are subject to it, but to those who wield it. The horror of Isabella's death also serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of compassion and intervention in cases of mental illness. The people around Isabella had the power to help her, but they chose instead to enable her delusions because it served their own interests or because they were too frightened or confused to act. This aspect of Isabella's story has particular relevance in our modern understanding of mental health and the responsibilities we have toward those who are suffering from psychological disorders. Her case illustrates the dangers of allowing untreated mental illness to progress unchecked, and it highlights the importance of early intervention and comprehensive treatment. The medical aspects of Isabella's case have also contributed to our understanding of the relationship between mental and physical health. Her story provides a dramatic example of how mental problems can manifest in devastating physical symptoms, and it underscores the importance of treating mental illness as seriously as any other medical condition. From a historical perspective, Isabella's case also serves an important reminder of how power structures can perpetuate and enable destructive behavior. The religious and political authorities who supported her delusions were not necessarily evil people, but they were caught up in systems that rewarded conformity and punished dissent. Their failure to challenge Isabella's increasingly dangerous behavior was as much a product of these systems as it was of their individual moral failures. This systemic aspect of Isabella's tragedy has implications for how we structure our own institutions and how we balance respect for authority with the need for accountability and oversight. Her story suggests that even well-intentioned systems can become destructive if they lack mechanisms for challenging dangerous or delusional behavior at the highest levels. The emotional impact of Isabella's story has also ensured its continued relevance across the centuries. The horror of her death is so visceral and immediate that it continues to shock and disturb readers even today. This emotional power has made her story an effective tool for illustrating abstract concepts about power, responsibility, and the dangers of extremism. But beyond its value as a cautionary tale, Isabella's story also deserves to be remembered as a human tragedy. Whatever her failures and delusions, she was a person who suffered terribly and died in circumstances that no human being should have to endure. Her story reminds us of the importance of compassion and the tragic consequences that can result when that compassion is absent. As our journey through this horrific tale comes to an end, we are left with questions that echo across the centuries. How does a person in the ultimate position of power and privilege end up dying in such unimaginable circumstances? What does Isabella's story tell us about the nature of authority, the dangers of unchecked power, and the tragic consequences of enabling destructive behavior? Isabella of Trastamara was not born a monster. She was a child who experienced trauma and developed beliefs that, while unusual, were not initially dangerous. But over time, these beliefs evolved into deadly obsessions that were fed and encouraged by those around her who should have known better. Her story is a reminder that mental illness can affect anyone, regardless of their social status or position. The queen, who commanded armies and made laws, was ultimately powerless against the delusions that consumed her mind and the parasites that consumed her body. Her royal authority, which should have ensured she received the best possible care, instead became a barrier that prevented anyone from helping her. The people who surrounded Isabella, her husband, her courtiers, her religious advisors, all bear responsibility for her tragic end. They had the power to intervene, to seek help, to challenge her dangerous beliefs. Instead, they chose to enable her delusions, either out of misguided loyalty, political calculation, or simple cowardice. Their failure to act reminds us that with privilege comes responsibility. Those who are close to power have an obligation to speak truth to authority, even when that truth is uncomfortable or unwelcome. The courtiers who stood by and watched their queen literally rot alive while convincing themselves they were serving her best interests provide a chilling example of how good intentions can enable the most terrible outcomes.
Isabella's story also reveals the dangers of extreme religious belief when it becomes disconnected from reason and compassion. The religious authorities who interpreted her self-destructive behavior as evidence of divine favor were not serving God or their queen. They were feeding a delusion that ultimately killed her. Their failure to distinguish between genuine spirituality and mental illness had devastating consequences that could have been avoided with more careful thought and greater moral courage. The medical aspects of Isabella's case remind us of how closely connected our mental and physical health truly are. Her psychological problems manifested in physical symptoms that became increasingly severe until they killed her. The doctors who observed her condition from a distance recognized that she was seriously ill, but they were prevented from providing treatment by the very delusions they should have been addressing. This aspect of Isabella's story has particular relevance today as we continue to work toward better integration of mental and physical health care.
Her case illustrates the importance of treating psychological disorders as seriously as any other medical condition, and the dangers of allowing stigma or misunderstanding to prevent people from receiving the help they need. The political implications of Isabella's story are equally significant. Her case demonstrates how absolute power can become self-destructive when it lacks appropriate checks and balances. The queen, who could command anyone to do anything, was ultimately unable to command herself to engage in the most basic self-care. This paradox of power, that those who have the most authority over others may have the least control over themselves, remains relevant today. Isabella's story serves as a warning about the dangers of concentrated power and the importance of maintaining systems that can intervene when leaders become unable to fulfill their responsibilities. The cover-up that followed Isabella's death is perhaps equally instructive. The successful suppression of the truth about her condition demonstrates both the power of authority to control information and the costs of that control. The resources devoted to hiding the truth could have been used for more productive purposes, and the climate of fear and secrecy that resulted from the cover-up had lasting negative effects. This aspect of Isabella's legacy reminds us of the importance of transparency and accountability in positions of power. The temptation to hide uncomfortable truths is always present, but the long-term costs of deception often outweigh any short-term benefits.
But perhaps the most important lesson of Isabella's story is the most basic one: the importance of human compassion and the tragic consequences of its absence. Isabella was ultimately a sick person who needed help. The fact that she was a queen with absolute power did not change this fundamental reality. The people around her failed her not because they were evil, but because they forgot to see her as a human being who was suffering. They became so caught up in the politics and protocols of royal court that they lost sight of the simple human need for care and intervention. This failure of compassion is not unique to medieval courts or royal families. It can happen anywhere that people become so focused on abstract concepts like loyalty, duty, or respect for authority that they forget their basic human obligations to one another. Isabella's story serves as a reminder that no system of authority, no matter how well-intentioned, can substitute for individual moral courage and human compassion. The protocols and hierarchies that govern our institutions are important, but they must never be allowed to override our fundamental responsibility to help those who are suffering. As we reflect on this tale of horror and tragedy, we might ask ourselves what we would have done if we had been in Isabella's court. Would we have had the courage to speak up? Would we have recognized the difference between genuine religious devotion and dangerous delusion? Would we have been willing to risk our own positions and safety to help someone who desperately needed help? These are not easy questions, and the honest answer for most of us is probably that we don't know. But Isabella's story reminds us of the importance of asking these questions and of preparing ourselves to act with courage and compassion when circumstances demand it. The queen who died covered in maggots was not just a medieval curiosity or a gruesome historical footnote. She was a human being whose story illuminates some of the darkest aspects of human nature and some of the most important challenges we face in organizing our societies and caring for one another. Her legacy is not just the horror of her death, but the lessons we can learn from her life.
In remembering Isabella of Trastamara, we honor not just her memory, but our commitment to ensuring that such tragedies never happen again. The queen who never bathed has finally been laid to rest, but the questions her story raises will continue to challenge us for generations to come. In facing those challenges with wisdom, courage, and compassion, we can ensure that her terrible death was not entirely in vain. In the end, Isabella's story is not just about one woman's descent into madness and decay. It is about all of us and the choices we make when confronted with suffering, delusion, and the abuse of power.
It is a mirror held up to human nature itself, reflecting both our capacity for cruelty and our potential for compassion. The woman who died covered in maggots was once a child who needed protection, a young woman who needed guidance, and a sick person who needed help. That she received none of these things when she needed them most is the true horror of her story. But in remembering her tale and learning from her tragedy, we can honor her memory and recommit ourselves to the values of compassion, courage, and human dignity that her story so powerfully illustrates. The queen who never bathed may be gone, but the lessons of her life and death remain with us still.